Crowned in 1226, Louis IX was the type of king who liked to take justice into his own hands. He'd often personally judge cases and deliver punishments in his great hall in Paris. And he also had a thing about the Jews. He forced Jews into manual labor with the Ordinance of Milan in 1230 and liked to debate Jews about their religion. In 1232, Pope Gregory IX received a letter claiming that the Talmud, the enormous Jewish text that had defined Jewish practice since being compiled in the 5th century, attacked the Catholic Church at least 35 times and needed to be destroyed. If the Pope agreed, there would be no more Talmud, and as an added bonus, no more Jewish practice. The Pope announced that the Talmud was going to be put on trial and instructed all Catholic institutions in France, Italy, Spain, and Portugal to seize all copies in their midst. Officials burst into synagogues and confiscated precious handwritten volumes of the Talmud from synagogues across Europe. 2 months later, the Talmud was put on trial, and can you guess who oversaw it? Yup, this guy. King Louis IX ordered 4 prominent rabbis to defend the Talmud. They faced off against Nicholas Donin, a Parisian Jew who had abandoned his faith and converted to Catholicism. Donin was not a fan of Judaism. He was also the one who'd written the damning letter to the Pope that started this crisis. King Louis set the rules. Rule number 1, the rabbis couldn't criticize Christianity in any way. And if rule number 2 could have been announced, it would have been that there's no way the Jews can win. The trial did not go well. At one point, King Louis got so enraged he shouted that a good Christian would plunge his sword into a Jew and not debate. One rabbi had to flee for his life. The remaining prominent rabbis argued all they could, but the Talmud was found guilty and condemned to burning. 2 years later, officials searched all over France for any remaining volumes of Talmud and other Hebrew books. On June 17, 1242, 24 wagons deposited close to 10,000 books at the Place de Grève near Notre Dame Cathedral, where they were burned. After the trial, King Louis expelled the Jews from France and led crusades to the Holy Land that targeted Jewish communities along the way. And even with his crimes against the Jews, they still named a city after him. How about that for history?
Shalom, Ka'ala Yahweh, Ba'Shem Yashai, Ba'Shem Kokordash. Double honors my teachers, the apostles and elders of Great Millstone. Peace and mercy to the elect, with the house of David reborn again in this generation. And Shalom to the 130 Yashaya-La, who today were known as the Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans, who before losing our true heritage, we were known as, and still are, the true Hebrew Israelites of the Holy Bible. In today's lesson, we're going to talk about the Talmud and what is it, and how there is a difference between the original Talmud, which the Israelites, or the so-called Negroes, created during their time in captivity, and the big difference that came from the additions or the commentary on the Talmud, which created its own collection of books, also referred to the Talmud, but the Babylonian Talmud, or the Talmud of these Amalekites, or the so-called Jewish people which are in the land today, that refer to themselves as the Israelis, who biblically and truly are the biblical Edomites. Okay, so but before we get into that, let's go ahead and read this. This is Matthew's 15:9. But in vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. Now, the commandments of men that the Messiah was referring to here is what the priests at the temple were teaching the Israelites during the time when the Messiah was here, right? The Messiah's true name being Yahweh, which is Hebrew for He is salvation, or He delivers. It wasn't Jesus or Yeshua or any of that stuff, right? But back to the point, He had called out the teachings of the priests of the temple. Now, what were those teachings? Well, let's go to the Bible timeline. That would be the teachings of the Talmud. Now, when you get into the original Talmud, right, this was a collection of teachings that came from and during the Babylonian captivity of their southern kingdom, right, or when the so-called Negroes were conquered by the Babylonians and were ultimately taken as slaves back into the Babylon. Now that actually took place, if you go back in time, about close to about 100 years later, then the southern kingdom went into captivity. Okay, you can read about that in 2 Kings 25 and 21. It's that the southern tribe, or the so-called Negroes, lost to Nebuchadnezzar II at the Battle of Carchemish. The Israelites helped Egypt rebel against Babylon and lost. And that's what ultimately happened, right? Because ultimately the southern kingdom, they were a vassal state, just as Egypt was to the Babylonians, which was the reigning empire in this time. Well, ultimately, Babylon found out about the rebellion that Egypt and Israel, or the southern kingdom of Israel, known as the kingdom of Judah, had conspired and ultimately just brought an end to their kingdom. You could see about here the fall of Zedekiah, which tells a horrible story where he had watched his sons be put to death before his eyes by the commandment of the King Nebuchadnezzar, and then they ultimately took out his eyes. So that was the last thing he saw before he was taken to Babylon and put in chains. Now, I said all that to say this: during the time before the fall of the last king of the kingdom of Judah, and also the Babylonian captivity, you had a lot of the priests start to collect teachings and rituals, ceremonies, interpretations of the Torah and the Bible, right? How they had seen things or how things were being carried out. And those teachings ultimately, when they were carried to Babylon, were carried with them. Now, they ultimately destroyed the scrolls which contained the biblical literature, but that was by the will of the Lord, because again, the Lord took the breath of life away from us Israelites. That's why he allowed the Babylonians to destroy it when they took the southern kingdom of Judah into captivity. Then we all know the story from there. You hear the story about Daniel and so forth. But ultimately what happens is that these commandments, which started during the downward spiral of the kingdom of Judah and then continued on with the teachings of the Babylonian influenced Israelites, right? These eventually were codified and eventually made into chapters and books, and these were referred to as the commandments of men. And today in modern times, they refer to this original Talmud as the Jerusalem Talmud. Okay, let's read it. This is it started around 200 AD, which is about the year that Jake took over Rome, to about 500 AD, right? That's when the original portions of the Talmud, or the Jerusalem Talmud, or the Israel Talmud, was created by Israelites, okay, so-called Negroes. It says the wicked teachings that came from the Pharisees and Sadducees, priests, before and during the Babylonian captivity. It is a collection of interpretations of the Bible, teachings, rituals, and instructions. This was the doctrine of most of the priests of Israel. Okay, so this is what so when you hear about when the Messiah and the apostles were all going up against the Pharisees and Sadducees and scribes, this is ultimately contained their teachings and their interpretations of how they were going to perform the rites and the rituals and everything. Okay, well, what happened after that? Well, let's go ahead and read this. Let's actually scroll down to the parts that I highlighted. So it tells you here, it says there are two basically Talmuds, right? Babylonian and the Jerusalem Talmud. Okay, now the difference between these two is that the Babylonian is Edomites doctrines. Okay, this is all their interpretations of what our priests wrote, and then the Jerusalem Talmud is that of the so-called Negroes, the original Israelites. Okay, the wicked scribes and Pharisees. Not all of them were wicked, but when you ultimately see how they fell, we put that moniker on them. Well, let's go and read it. It says, let me just read this introduction. The process of Gemara proceeded in what were then the two major centers of Jewish scholarship, Galilee and Babylonia. Of course, now by the way, this is a lot of this is a lie. Okay, the fake so-called Jews today that created the Babylonia Talmud, they try to say that there was connections between the original Galilee schools. Okay, these were the Israelites that were in the Galilee academies, right over there in Palestine, right, or ancient Israel. And then you got the Khazars that came along and took on the mantle and the teachings, and then they ultimately created these interpretations and commentary on the Jerusalem Talmud. Okay, and look at these devils trying to connect both of them. It says, correspondingly, two bodies of analysis developed. The two works of Talmud were created. The older compilation is called the Jerusalem Talmud, right? This is Jake's actual teachings from the priests, okay? And the Talmud, the Talmud Yashaya-La, and it was compiled in the 4th century in Galilee. Okay, so basically, these were the original Israelites, right? The southern kingdom, right? It says the Babylonian Talmud was compiled about the year 500, although it continued to be edited later. Now, edited later was ultimately when the Amalekites or the Khazars came into this man-made religion referred to as Judaism, where they took the heritage of the Israelites, namely the southern kingdom, and they stole it and they used it as a cloak for their maliciousness. Okay, and it says the word Talmud, when used without qualification, usually refers to the Babylonian Talmud, because again, this is what is ultimately used today as the main book of worship by the Israelis. Okay, because those Israelis over there, they don't actually know the Bible, right? They don't know prophecy. They do not fit the prophecies, and this is and they definitely don't go into the New Testament, because the New Testament calls them out and condemns them. This is why they refuse to acknowledge the New Testament or the Messiah. Okay, but what does the Bible say about that? Psalms 50 and 16. But unto the wicked God saith, what hast thou to do to declare my statutes, or that thou shouldest take my covenant in thy mouth? So you see, these devils who are claiming to be the chosen people, right, the so-called Israelis, you know, which truly are the biblical Edomites, right, the adversaries of the chosen people of the Bible, right, they say that they are the chosen people, and hence they go around and they give these lofty words and these, you know, inflated explanations of trying to break down the Bible, when all they're doing is running people around in mental pretzel knots. Okay, and the thing is when you really get into what they're actually studying, they're not studying the Torah, which is the original Bible. It's the first 5 books of the Bible, right, which is what the books that Moses created for the Israelites, right? They refer to it and they study it, but they don't live by it, right? Their main book of worship is the Babylonian Talmud. So let's go back to the Bible timeline and let's break this down. So ultimately, you had the original Jerusalem Talmud created. And then you had all the things of when Rome switched power, the Vatican was created, ultimately established religion. The Edomites flee Rome, go up to the Caucasus Mountains where they'll stay for 1,000 years and come out being known as the Caucasians. The doctrine of hell was invented by the Vatican, right? The trans-Saharan slave trade took place, which is what took place by the hands of Ishmael, the Arabs, and the true Hamites, right? The true native African blacks. Okay, they started to enslave the Israelite refugees that had fled down into Africa in 70 AD. Well, they were now in 600 AD being taken as slaves and being made a market, right? Being made a product by Ishmael and Ham. So they got to pay for that shit. And that there ultimately happened to Levi, Judah, and Benjamin, the southern kingdom. The Quran was created. Those Israelites who went into slavery under the trans-Saharan slave trade, again, they eventually, after about 100 years, just like Jake always does, they started to rise in power. They freed themselves and they became a people of notoriety. This is where you get the Moorish Empire, which were simply the slaves that had adopted the religion of their masters, the Arabs, and ultimately went on to establish the Grenada and all stuff there in Spain, right? And then here's the event that we wanted to get to. So in 740 AD, after the Edomites had fled up into the Caucasus Mountains, you had the top tribe of the nation of Edom start to come out of the Caucasus Mountains before that, right? And they settled right at the base, right? The Caucasus Mountains are right here. Here's the Black Sea, which means down here in the map is where Israel's at. Well, eventually these Amalekites, right, or Edomites that were in Rome, they eventually fled up into the Caucasus Mountains, and they stayed there for 1,000 years. Well, the top tribe, Amalek, eventually ventured out and settled in the base of the Caucasus Mountains and claimed this land for theirs. The rest of the nation of Edom eventually would wander eastward into the land of Europe and eventually infiltrate Europe, and that would take place. But staying focused here on Khazariah, these Amalekites, which again are just simply the top tribe of Edom, they eventually started to be surrounded by religious states which were not friendly to them because they were a pagan nation. Okay, they basically were witches. Okay, they dealt with magic, potions, things like that. They would rob you, right? And they would use pharmaceuticals to put you under spells or get you all mixed up. Which is why they control the pharmaceutical companies today. But the point being is that when the nation of Amalek decided to hide themselves to protect themselves against their Arab and Christian or Catholic neighbors, they eventually took on a religion of their own that they created, which was referred to as Judaism, which was based off of the heritage of by then, during this time, 740 AD, the lost Israelites, which no longer were in existence. And people really, unless they were a very learned person, didn't understand that the Moors were the Israelites in a lost state of mind, in a Gentile state of mind, right? And the Northern Kingdom, the Latinos and Native Americans, forget about it. The people there in the old world, the Eastern Hemisphere, had no idea where the Northern Kingdom Israelites went, right? This is why they refer to them as the lost tribes of Israel. Okay, so what happened is these Amalekites took our identity, and when they took our identity, they also took our language, right? They took the Hebrew characters, which at the time, the Hebrew that was being used, which was the modified Hebrew version known as the Assyrian Hebrew, which is what our enemies, the Assyrians, had placed upon us, right? They had taken our alphabet and rewrote it, right? And this is the Assyrian Hebrew, which is fucking hilarious, because if the so-called Amalekites are the true Jews, they would never have used Assyrian Hebrew. They would have stayed using the Paleo Hebrew, or what's referred to scientifically as the Phoenician Hebrew, okay? Now, but they didn't, and they used this. And why is that? Well, because they took on at that time modern understandings of Hebrewism and all that type of stuff. And what they did, these little red dollars here and dots, these are what adds vowels and consonants to the Hebrew language, which is a very old language, and it's very simple. There's no vowels in the original Paleo or Phoenician Hebrew, but the Yiddish, trying to hide their Germanic language within our alphabet, they had to add those vowels so that way they could pronounce their Yiddish words. And again, Yiddish is simply the Germanic language that the Khazars used, but they hid its language underneath the Hebrew characters, and this is what's referred to as Yiddish. So again, after they converted, they brought over their language, took over the Paleo-Hebrew language, right, our language, and not only that, but while they were studying in a documentary that talks about this, says that they didn't vibe with the Bible and the teachings of it. And the reason is because that's a spiritual book and it's protected by the Most High, so he wasn't going to let these devils basically break it down. So they didn't vibe with it, but what they did vibe with were the teachings of the priests of Israel, right? And they took those teachings, and then about 200 years, right, after the last rule update to the Talmud was created by the original Israelites, they went on and they took the teachings and they started to write their own versions of it and their own interpretations and commentary on the original Jerusalem Talmud. Right? Let's read it. It says, known as the Babylonian Talmud, it is the main book of worship for the Amalekites. It holds their own wicked teachings based off of the Israelite Talmud and their Edomite interpretations, right? And that's why when you read their Talmud, it's very wicked. There's a lot of crazy ass verses in it. I'm not even gonna, I'll go ahead and, post it real quick, and you can see just a lot of these verses are just ridiculous, right? But some of them are based off of the Bible, right? But let's get back to what it's talking about here, right? Because it says, so remember, right here they're trying to say that the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud are simply a continuation of each other, but they're not, right? It says the Babylonian Talmud was compiled about the year 500, although it continued to be edited later. The edited later was Amalek starting to add his own commentary to these works. Then it says, while the editors of the Jerusalem Talmud, right, the Israelites, the Babylonian Talmud, each mention the other commentary. Now that's a bunch of bullshit, right? That means that the Israelites had to say that there was going to come a time when foreigners were going to come in and start to add to the Talmud, but they didn't, okay? But here's the point. It says, most scholars believe that these documents were written independently. So you see, these devils, this is what they'll do. They'll give you a lie, which is what's highlighted here in red, but then they'll give you the truth. But if you don't understand what actually happened, these devils are going to run circles around you, right? Let's go down here. It's talking about the Jerusalem Talmud. It says the Jerusalem Talmud, also known as the Talmud de Eretz Israel, Talmud of the land of Israel, or Palestinian Talmud, was one of the two compilations of the Jewish religious teachings and commentary that was transmitted orally for centuries prior to the complete compilation by Jewish scholars in the land of Israel. Again, these are the Israelites, the Israelite priests, that when the time when Yashaya came on the scene, he was, condemning these people for misleading the people and making the people go more towards like the teachings of the temple, the priest, holding the ceremonies over the laws of God, basically, right? And then if you go down here, it says, despite its incomplete state, right, the original Israelite Talmud, because it was just a collection of teachings and instructions of the Bible, right? Because if you go here, this is where you actually get to the Talmud online. It's sephara.org, right? And then you got the Jerusalem Talmud, which is all these chapters, right? And like I said again, there's ceremonies, rituals, commentary on the Bible, right? These are actual Israelite priests. People would come later on, like Flavius Josephus, right? He was a priest, right? All the priests we read about in the Bible, these would be like their teachings, okay? Now check this out, right? Look at the Babylonian Talmud. This is Amalek's Talmud, or which is, when you say Talmud, that you're mostly talking about the Babylonian Talmud. Look at how many fucking chapters these devils have added on to it, okay? Look at this, and it keeps going on and on, right? This is Esau's, this is Edomites, right? This is Amalek's fucking teaching. This has nothing to do with the Bible, okay? And these devils hid all their secret mysticism in here, right? This is where, when you understand what Kabbalah is, Kabbalah, which is that little red bracelet that people wear, they don't even know what the fuck it means, or it's that hand symbol with the eye in the middle. That's Kabbalah, okay? What that is that's Amalekite or Edomite witchcraft, okay? That's the shit that they hid in here. Also, the Babylonian money system that is established around the westernized world, it all comes from the understanding of the Babylonian knowledge, right? This is why they call it Babylonian money magic, right? Because again, it comes from the teachings of Babylon, which can all be found in the Talmud. Other things about how gematria works, like gematria comes from the Babylonian Talmud, because again, that's all, it's like a high form of witchcraft, mysticism, right? Trying to decode the gearing of the universe, right? Trying to figure out the mechanisms of heaven. That's what gematria is. This is why I don't mess with that shit, because it's connected to the Talmud, and especially the wicked side of the Talmud, right? Or should I say the more wicked side of the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, which was created by these Amalekites. This is Exodus 17:14. And Yahweh said unto Moses, write this for a memorial in a book, and rehearse it in the ears of Joshua. For I will utterly put out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. So you see, these Amalekites, the so-called Jews or Israelis, they are the mortal enemies of the Lord. Okay, the Lord it says He's going to have continual war with them throughout all the time that they're here, right? And when you read about Amalek, which is the top tribe of the nation of Edom, right? All of them are devils, but again, especially these Amalekites. And right now, the Lord is showing them plainly for the devils they are, right? By showing all the atrocities they're doing and everything. Well, this is all part of the plan. This is the Lord's plan with His war against Amalek, right? And Amalek's doing the same thing. Why do you think you hear about all these child sacrifices and all these wicked ass events? Is because they're doing this to spite the Lord, to war against Him, right? You may just see a rocket being shot into space, or people doing something called the spirit cooking, or you'll hear about babies dying, by accident, but really what they are sacrifices. These are attacks at the Lord by these Edomites, and being done purposely, because again, this is a spiritual war, right? So back to this real quick. It says, despite the incomplete state, the Jerusalem Talmud remains an indispensable source of knowledge of the development of the Jewish law in the Holy Land, right? So remember I was telling you, it's basically a collection of the rituals, the laws, the interpretations of the Bible that the priests made. It says, it was also an important primary source for the study of the Babylonian Talmud by the Kororian school, blah, 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 Krishna. This just tells you what schools taught it. It says, now this is Amalek's Talmud, right? It says, the Babylonian Talmud, the Talmud Bavli, consists of documents compiled over the period of late antiquity, right? Now notice here, they say 3rd to 6th century, which is total bullshit. Because late antiquity it goes even further. It goes back to the 8th or the 7th and the 8th century. These devils came in on the 8th century, basically 740 AD, okay, in Europe, right? That's where these devils converted to Judaism, and that's where the Babylonian Talmud, and I'm sure before that these devils started to interpret it. It says, during this time, the most important of the Jewish centuries in Mesopotamia, a region called Babylonia, is Jewish source, right? So these devils, and that's it, Akim. This is just a bad highlight down here. But yeah, so I just wanted to kind of highlight and show you, right? Because see, look, this is Amalek's collection of all his Talmudic, wicked Edomite teachings, okay, that he's compiled, and this is the book that they read from, where you have the original Talmud. It's just one book, okay? So these devils, they're not the people, and there's a reason why the Talmud was put on trial, right? Because these devils, they have written a lot of crazy shit into this, basically going against a lot of these heathens. Now, a lot of that is based off of the Bible, but these devils have the wrong interpretation of it, and they're even trying to establish the kingdom of heaven upon the face of the earth today, which is why you're seeing the coming forth of the new world order. But either way, Hakim, I just wanted to break this down and go into the differences of the Talmud, the original Jerusalem and Edomites version of the Talmud, right? The Babylonian Talmud. So hopefully this video was edifying. Until next time, I want to give all honor and glory and praises to Yahweh B'Hashem Yashai B'Hashem Ruach Kodash. Shalom.